Dracula's Guest, a horror story gone wrong. I never believed in the supernatural. Not truly. I enjoyed horror stories, studied folklore, and even traveled to so-called haunted locations. But I had always maintained a safe distance between fiction and reality. That changed the night I participated in a reenactment of Dracula's Guest. It had started as a literary event, something designed to thrill and unnerve. An immersive experience meant to transport us into the world of Bram Stoker's forgotten tale. When I received the invitation, I was ecstatic. You are invited to a private dramatic reading of Dracula's Guest in Munich on the eve of Walpurgis Night, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for true connoisseurs of horror literature. The letter bore no signature, only a wax seal with an intricate crest that I didn't recognize. But the location, the Old Inn just outside Munich, was famous among Gothic literature enthusiasts. Supposedly, it stood near the very road Stoker wrote about in his tale, the place where his unnamed protagonist ignored the warnings and wandered into the storm, into the mouth of terror itself. I arrived at dusk. The inn was ancient, its walls thick with age and its windows barely holding against the howling wind outside. There were 7 others in attendance, each of them literary scholars, horror enthusiasts, or actors. Our host, an elderly man with sunken eyes and a voice like crumbling parchment, greeted us in the candlelit dining hall. He never gave his name. The story must be told properly, he said. Not just read, but experienced. His words were cryptic, but we were eager for immersion. We drank spiced wine, feasted on dark bread and gamey meats, and finally gathered by the fireplace as the storm raged outside. The reading began. An actor, dressed in a heavy cloak, took the role of the protagonist. He spoke in a trembling voice, recounting the journey through the snowy countryside, the warnings from the innkeeper, the sudden storm, and the eerie presence of the abandoned village. Then, something strange happened. As the actor described the protagonist's approach to the ruined village, the room seemed to grow colder. The candles flickered violently. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters. The actor paused, suddenly uneasy. I felt it too. Presence. The host leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Continue. The actor swallowed and pressed on. He spoke of the ruined crypt, the strange blue flames dancing in the night, the heavy slab covering the tomb that seemed to move on its own. A scream. One of the guests, a woman seated at the far end of the room, clutched her throat. The candles went out. For a moment, all was darkness and chaos. I heard scraping, heavy breathing. A chair toppled over. Someone gasped. Then the fire flared back to life. The woman was gone. Her chair lay overturned, her wine glass shattered on the floor, deep red liquid seeping into the wood. We all stared at each other, wide-eyed, unsure if this was part of the act. This is part of the show, right? One of the guests stammered. The host said nothing. His expression was unreadable. Then another guest, the actor playing the protagonist, let out a strangled gasp. His hands went to his throat, as if something invisible was squeezing the air from his lungs. We rushed to help him, but he collapsed, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. His body twitched once. Then he was still. The air in the room turned suffocating. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, trapped by the sheer wrongness of the moment. We need to leave, someone said. Now. We turned to the host. His face was shadowed, unreadable. The story is not yet complete, he murmured. No, screw this, I snapped. People are dead. That was when I noticed something horrifying. The door, the only exit, was gone. Not locked, not blocked, simply gone. Where it had once stood was now only solid wall. Terrible realization settled over me. We were inside the story. The host finally rose to his feet, his movements slow, deliberate. You misunderstand, he said, his voice now different, deeper, older. This is not a reenactment. I backed away. The storm outside roared louder. The walls of the inn seemed to pulse, as if the very structure were alive. Then I saw it. A shadow. No, a figure. Tall, gaunt, draped in tattered finery. its face impossibly pale. It moved without sound, without effort. Its eyes burned like smoldering embers, fixed upon us with a hunger that defied words. One of the guests screamed and bolted, vanishing into the darkened hallway. The thing did not chase. It merely turned its head, watching, waiting. A whisper curled through the room, though no lips moved. The guest has arrived. The walls closed in. The fire dimmed. One by one, my companions disappeared, each swallowed by the shifting shadows. I ran. The corridors twisted, warped. I burst into room after room, only to find myself back where I started. Trapped. The host, no, not the host anymore, stood beside the figure. Their eyes gleamed in unison. "You should not have come here," they intoned as one. The last candle went out, and then there was nothing. I woke in my own bed. Sunlight streamed through the window. My clothes were clean, my hands steady. A dream? A hallucination? No, because the parchment invitation still lay on my nightstand. But now, at the bottom, scrawled in dark ink, were 3 new words. "You are next." Dracula's Guest, a horror story gone wrong. I never should have gone there. The invitation had arrived on an aged, yellowed parchment, sealed with dark red wax bearing an unfamiliar crest. The words were elegantly scrawled in ink that smelled faintly of iron. "You are cordially invited to an exclusive literary event at Bran Castle, Romania, where a select group of horror enthusiasts shall partake in a dramatic retelling of Bram Stoker's lost tale, Dracula's Guest. Only the most devoted admirers of the Gothic shall bear witness to its true conclusion." I considered it a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A chance to visit the very heart of vampire folklore and participate in a reenactment of one of the most mysterious lost stories ever written. As an amateur horror writer and historian, I was enthralled. The castle stood against a backdrop of jagged mountains, its towers piercing the mist. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and damp stone. I was not alone. 7 others had accepted the invitation. Some were scholars, others actors, and a few were simply horror fanatics like myself. Our host, a tall man named Gregor, greeted us at the gates with a deep bow. His thin lips barely concealed his elongated canines. It was an act, I told myself, a theatrical touch to set the mood. Inside, the castle was just as one would expect: worn tapestries, candlelit corridors, and grand chambers adorned with faded portraits of long-dead nobility. A feast had been prepared for us. Dark meats, thick stews, and goblets of deep red wine. I hesitated before drinking. My mind, overactive with ghost stories and legends, whispered a warning. The evening proceeded with dramatic readings from Dracula's Guest. The actors were impeccable, their voices echoing through the vaulted halls. But something was off. The deeper we went into the story, the colder the room became. The fire in the great hearth barely gave off warmth. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. When one of the actors, a woman named Elise, recited a passage about an unknown presence watching the protagonist from the stormy darkness, the candles flickered violently. I laughed nervously, but no one joined me. And then the real horror began. One by one, my fellow guests started disappearing. First was a professor from London. He excused himself to use the restroom, but never returned. We searched, calling his name down the labyrinthine hallways, but only silence answered. Then it was the actress, Elise. She let out a scream mid-sentence during her reading, clutching her throat. The lights flickered, and when they steadied, she was gone. Panic set in. Some of us demanded to leave, but Gregor only smiled. "The story is not yet complete," he said. That was when I noticed the changes. The tapestries now depicted scenes of suffering, figures impaled upon stakes, their faces twisted in eternal agony. The stone walls, previously cold and dry, were now slick, glistening as if wet with something dark. I reached out hesitantly, drawing my fingers back sticky with crimson. The others ran. I stayed frozen, heart hammering in my chest. A whisper slithered through the chamber. "He watches," came from nowhere, from everywhere. I turned sharply, but the room was empty save for Gregor, standing unnaturally still. "Who is watching?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His grin widened. "You already know." A gust of wind blew through the chamber, though no windows were open. The candle flames stretched high, then extinguished in an instant, plunging us into utter darkness. A scraping sound echoed from the corridor, like nails dragging against stone. The others were still screaming somewhere in the castle, but their voices were becoming distorted, as if something inhuman had taken hold of their throats. Then I saw it, a tall figure, just outside the candle's dying glow. Pale, impossibly thin, dressed in decayed finery. Its eyes burned like embers, sunken deep into hollow sockets. When it moved, it did so with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than stepping. It opened its mouth, revealing fangs, not the theatrical kind, but jagged, uneven, grotesquely long. Gregor stepped aside, bowing deeply. "My lord," he whispered. I ran through corridors that twisted in ways they hadn't before. I burst through doors that led to rooms I had never seen. The castle itself had changed. It was no longer a place of history, but a living, breathing entity of darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a woman's voice screamed. Then another, then silence. I forced myself onward. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred with terror. My only thought was escape. Finally, I found a door, the great entrance hall. I threw myself at it, clawing at the massive iron handles. The wood splintered beneath my nails, but it would not budge. A whisper curled around my ear. "The story is not yet complete." A cold hand settled on my shoulder. My body seized with an unnatural stillness. I turned. He was there, inches away. His eyes bore into mine, and for a moment, all sound ceased. No wind, no screaming, no heartbeat. He opened his mouth, exhaling a breath colder than death. Darkness swallowed me. I woke up in my hotel room in Bucharest. The morning sun streamed through the window, warm and golden. My clothes were clean, neatly folded at the foot of my bed. My shoes, however, were caked in dried mud. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. No messages, no missed calls, no proof of anything. The others, where were they? I searched online for news of missing persons, unexplained disappearances. Nothing. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? Then I noticed the parchment on my nightstand. The same invitation, unchanged except for one difference. At the bottom, in fresh ink, was a single line. "You were the only one who ran." A shadow flickered at the corner of my vision, though nothing was there. The story wasn't over. Not yet. Dracula's guest. The forgotten curse. I should have listened. The warnings were clear. The villagers begged me not to go. But arrogance is a strange thing. It makes men believe they are untouchable, that ghost stories and superstitions are nothing more than whispers of an ignorant past. Now, I write this with trembling hands, locked inside a room with only a dwindling candle to keep the darkness at bay. If you are reading this, know that I did not survive the night. And if you hear footsteps outside your door before dawn, do not open it. It began with an invitation. The Count himself had summoned me, a rare honor. My business in Transylvania was dull, yet necessary, and his letter had promised not just hospitality, but insight into the very mysteries of his land. A scholar such as myself could not refuse. Yet the villagers at the last inn before the Borgo Pass pleaded with me. "You must not go tonight," the innkeeper warned. "It is Walpurgis night, the dead walk." I laughed. The night was crisp as I rode, my horse restless beneath me. The moon hung low, casting silver light over the endless expanse of wilderness. The deeper I went, the more the world around me seemed wrong. The wind carried whispers. Shadows moved where there should be none. My horse whinnied and stopped suddenly, refusing to take another step. Ahead, an ancient graveyard sprawled, forgotten by time. I dismounted, drawn forward by something I could not name. The tombs were worn with age, inscriptions eroded by centuries of wind and rain. And there, in the center, a single crypt stood apart. Its doors were open. Inside, something moved. A voice, soft as silk, called to me. "You should not have come." My breath turned to ice in my lungs. A shape emerged, tall, impossibly thin, wrapped in tattered burial cloth. Its face was pale as moonlight, lips curled in something that was neither smile nor snarl. But its eyes, black pits that swallowed the light. They saw me. The crypt groaned, the earth quaking beneath it. The tombstones around me cracked as if unseen hands were clawing their way to the surface. A cold unlike any winter storm gripped my chest, and I stumbled back, my voice trapped in my throat. The figure took a step forward, then another. The whispers grew louder, rising to a terrible crescendo as the wind howled through the trees. My horse, panicked, tore its reins free and bolted into the darkness. I was alone. The thing in the crypt raised a hand, and the world shattered. I do not know how long I was unconscious. When I woke, the graveyard was gone. I was lying in the ruins of a castle. No sky above, only endless blackness stretching where the ceiling should have been. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of rot and something metallic. I was not alone. Shapes lurked in the corners, figures that should not be, yet were. They shifted, watching, waiting. Their whispers crawled through my mind like insects. Then, the voice returned. "You have been expected." A shadow moved, and Count Dracula himself stepped forward. But this was not the nobleman I had imagined, the refined host of whispered legend. No, this was something else entirely. His presence was suffocating. His smile was too wide, his teeth too sharp. He studied me like a hunter sizing up wounded prey. "You ignored the warnings," he murmured, amusement flickering in his eyes. Curiosity is a dangerous thing. I wanted to run, to wake from whatever nightmare this was. But I could not move. Dracula raised a hand, and the figures in the dark came alive. They crawled toward me, not walking, but slithering, their limbs bending in ways no human body should. Their whispers turned to laughter, hollow and hungry. "You were never my guest," the Count said, voice velvet and cruel. "You were my offering." Then the figures pounced, and the candle goes out. Dracula's guest, the lost night. I have often wondered what might have happened if I had obeyed my host's warning that night. Had I heeded his words and stayed within the inn, perhaps my name would not be whispered in fearful tones among the villagers. Perhaps I would not be recounting this tale, my hands shaking as I write. But I did not listen. And so, I will tell you the truth of what I found beyond the cursed road, what awaited me in the snow-covered graveyard, under the watching eyes of something ancient and hungry. I had arrived in Munich the evening before, en route to Transylvania for business. My host at the inn, a grizzled man with wary eyes, pleaded with me not to take the road north. He insisted that travelers who ventured beyond the old stone marker never returned. "It is Walpurgis night," he had said, voice barely above a whisper. "The dead walk tonight." I laughed at his superstitions and reassured him that I would return before dark. Armed with nothing but my walking stick and a revolver for comfort, I set off on horseback, the crisp air invigorating me. The road was treacherous, winding through skeletal trees that clawed at the sky. Clouds hung low, smothering the sun, and a peculiar silence draped the landscape, as if the world itself held its breath. I pressed on, following an old path that veered into the hills. The ruins of an ancient graveyard lay ahead, tombstones jutting from the frozen earth like broken teeth. The horse beneath me whinnied, refusing to go further. I dismounted. A strange compulsion drove me forward, my boots crunching through the frost-laced grass. There was something about the place, an air of forgotten things, of a time when men whispered prayers before stepping too close. A cold wind howled through the trees. Then I saw it. A single tomb stood apart from the others, a monstrous slab of stone with carvings worn nearly smooth by time. A name had been etched there once, but the letters were illegible. The ground before it was strangely untouched by snow, as if the earth rejected its presence. A sensation of being watched crawled over my skin. I turned, pulse quickening. The wind had died. The trees did not move. And yet, the shadows, they moved. I blinked, heart hammering. Shapes slithered between the tombstones, dark forms that swayed unnaturally, eyes glinting with an inhuman hunger. Then a whisper, not from my mind, but from the earth itself. Leave now, before he wakes. The voice was not one, but many, a chorus of hushed warnings carried by the wind. My breath plumed in the freezing air as I took a step back. Then the slab of stone groaned. A crack splintered through the ancient tomb. Something stirred beneath it. The ground bulged, as if something vast and terrible were shifting beneath the surface. A long, slow breath exhaled from the depths, filling the air with the stench of decay and old, wet earth. Then, a hand, pale, clawed, and impossibly strong, emerged from the crack. I stumbled backward, tripping over a half-buried skull. The shadows around me convulsed, creeping closer. The figures were no longer merely shapes but things. Gaunt, lifeless faces stretched over skeletal frames, their hollow mouths gaping in silent screams. My horse neighed wildly in the distance, tearing free from its reins and galloping into the night. I was alone, the tomb shattered, and from the darkness within he rose, a figure draped in a funeral shroud, his body impossibly tall and thin, like a corpse stretched beyond human proportions. His face, oh God, his face, pale as death, his lips dark with something that glistened under the moonlight. His eyes locked onto mine, red as fresh spilled blood. Dracula, not a man, not a legend, but a force older than time itself, waking from slumber to greet an uninvited guest. He smiled, and in that instant my body was no longer my own. A terrible paralysis gripped me, my limbs frozen, my breath shallow. His voice, though barely a whisper, thundered inside my skull. You should not have come. I could not move, could not speak. The shadows drew nearer, circling me like starving wolves. I felt their breath on my skin, the unbearable cold of the grave seeping into my bones. Dracula took a step forward. With a flick of his wrist, the air itself seemed to shatter. The sky cracked like glass, darkness spilling through. The stars above winked out one by one. And then, a bell. Far away, the faint toll of a church bell rang through the night. The figures shrieked and recoiled, their hollow faces contorting in agony. The tombstones trembled, the earth itself resisting whatever force had been unleashed. Dracula's expression darkened. His red eyes burned into mine. A promise. A warning. You are not meant to leave. The world lurched. The wind roared back to life. The sky snapped into place, the stars once again flickering above. The paralysis shattered. I ran. I did not look back. I did not stop. I reached the road, half mad with terror, my breath ragged. The inn's lights burned in the distance, a beacon of salvation. I stumbled through the door, my body drenched in sweat, my mind fractured. The innkeeper's face went pale. You saw him, he whispered. I nodded, my voice lost. He muttered a prayer under his breath, then hurried to the door, locking it with shaking hands. You should not have come back. I did not sleep that night, nor any night after, for in the shadows beyond the candlelight, I feel his gaze, watching, waiting, and I know he let me go, but not out of mercy. No, he let me live because he wants me to remember, a guest who overstayed his welcome, a soul already marked. And when the church bells fail, when the night is finally his once more, I know he will return.